What's up, ladies and gentlemen? I'm the Best Virginian, and if you've been a longtime viewer of the channel, you know I am a big fan of visiting old cemeteries. For me, visiting old cemeteries is like visiting an outdoor history and art museum, except for with way smaller crowds. One can learn a lot about a region, its peoples, and its history by visiting some of the cemeteries in the area. And normally when I'm driving down the road, I see an interesting looking cemetery or just a nice one in a rural area to visit. Very rarely do I do research on them beforehand, but sometimes I really should. And today we are going to talk about the Longreach Cemetery and try to figure out who or what is the Longreach Cemetery Specter. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? I am the Best Virginian. I bring you history and travel videos from across the great state of West Virginia, and since it is October, I decided I was going to dip a little bit into the paranormal and talk about the Specter of the Longreach Cemetery. So back Memorial Day weekend, I went to the Longreach Cemetery, and the caretakers of the cemetery were there. I gave them a donation, told them I was there for historical research and preservation purposes, and they gave me a really good tour of the cemetery. But as I was getting ready to leave, one of the caretakers came to me and told me to come back whenever I wished. He appreciated what I was doing, but to be wary of the specters, which is kind of a weird thing to bring up. But then once I came back home and started doing some research on the Longreach Cemetery, I realized if there was ever to be a haunted cemetery, this would probably be it. And in fact, probably the only more haunted cemetery I could think of would be the Peninsula Cemetery. The cemetery in Wheeling, they dug up a third of so they could run a interstate straight through the middle of it. Yeah, I've already done a video on that one if you would like to check it out, and if this is the type of content that you are interested in, go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. If you think you have in the past, just go ahead and check down there, because for whatever reason, I've been losing a lot of subscribers here lately. So now, the Longreach Cemetery is located in Tyler County, West Virginia, just south of Sistersville. And if you've ever traveled from Moundsville to Point Pleasant or anywhere in between, you have probably passed the cemetery at one point or another. Now, it wasn't until I visited the Longreach Cemetery that I found out it is the oldest cemetery in Tyler County, West Virginia, and one of the oldest in the Ohio River Valley. Now, the first resident of the Longreach Cemetery was Rachel Grist Jolly. She was born in what is today Wheeling, West Virginia, but back then, we're talking about the 1700s, it was known as the Fort Henry area. At a fairly young age, Rachel Grist Jolly was attacked during a skirmish in between settlers and the indigenous peoples of the area. Her skull was fractured with a war club and she was partially scalped. She was eventually found and taken to a nearby doctor who basically did the only thing you could do to someone with this type of injury in the 1700s, and that was he drilled a hole in her skull to relieve some of the pressure from the brain and to drain some of the blood from inside the skull. And miraculously, she survived. Not just did she survive, but she went on to have 5 children. Her husband, Henry Jolly, Captain Henry Jolly, was the first operator of the ferry in Sistersville, West Virginia. He was also a highly decorated politician from Washington County, Pennsylvania, but this is a West Virginia history video, so we don't really care about that. Even though everything south of Pittsburgh should technically be part of what is now West Virginia, that's a topic for another day. That is a whole other video. Now, Rachel would pass away at age 40 due to complications from her injuries that she sustained at a young age, but let's be honest, even in the 21st century, mothering 5 children with a traumatic brain injury is risky. This was the 1700s. Now, Rachel Grist Jolly was buried on the former Nicholas Wells farm. The land that she was buried on was owned by the Wells family. Eventually, later on, land would be obtained for the entire cemetery, and I'm not an expert in property law or acquisition, but her grave to this day is located outside the cemetery fence. And because her grave was the only one located outside the cemetery fence, all sorts of urban legends started forming about why this was, and eventually the urban legend started that this was a witch's grave. And for this reason, her grave was regularly defaced and vandalized until it was eventually at some point stolen. In recent history, they did provide a new marker for Rachel, but they really shouldn't have had to. I pretty much say this anytime I do a cemetery tourism video. Do not vandalize cemeteries. I shouldn't have to say that, but it's a reoccurring theme as I research these old cemeteries. Now, while Rachel was the first white settler to be buried in Tyler County, the history of this area being used for burials go back centuries, millennia even. There was once a massive earthworks between Binge Run and Longreach. It was first documented in 1808, where there were 2 long stone and earthwork structures in the area that were described as an ancient encampment. Now, 2 of these structures were said to be between 6 and 12 feet tall, made of stone and earth walls, and ran parallel to each other with several burial mounds in between them. Initially, this entire encampment was estimated to take up an area of about 10 acres, but later surveys were done to include structures and mounds outside of these 2 parallel walls, and this entire ancient encampment was estimated to be some 400 acres in area. So with a structure that large, what happened to it? Well, like a lot of other prehistoric indigenous structures in the Ohio River Valley, farmers leveled most of the mounds for farming, and the stones were used in construction projects and paving projects, and what was left of some of these structures in the mid-19th century were leveled over to make room for industrialization projects. Think things like factories and roads and railroads, things like that. By 1965, the West Virginia Geological and Economic Survey made a mention of the massive Binge Run earthworks in the archaeological section, but it simply noted that there was nothing left of the ancient encampment. By this point in history, there was no evidence left that it had ever existed, again, because much of it had either been leveled or taken to use in other construction projects. So typically on this channel, when we talk about specters, we're talking about entities, beings that exist in the Moundsville area, predominantly the moving shadows that are most commonly seen in and around the former West Virginia State Penitentiary because of the penitentiary's nearness to the Grave Creek Mound, which is also a massive indigenous site, which made it super weird when the caretaker used the term specters, not ghost, not spirits, specifically specters. That was when I realized I needed to look up a little bit more into the history of this area, and I was really amazed when I found out about the ancient encampment near Binge Run. So maybe Rachel is the specter of Longreach. Maybe it's some, millennia old individual that either built or lived in this ancient encampment that makes up the Longreach Specter. That is some of the history of the Long Reach Cemetery. I hope you learned something today. I hope you enjoyed some of the pictures I threw up here throughout the video. If there's any other historical cemeteries you would like for me to visit, let me know down in the comment section. If there's any other paranormal or ghost story related content in West Virginia you would like to see me talk about, let me know. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Leave a like on it. Until next time, don't forget to stay wild, stay wonderful, and I'll talk to you later.